Question number 6, the Right Honourable Winston Peters.
Mr Speaker, this question is to the Prime Minister and asks, does he stand by all his statements?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr Speaker, yes.
Supplementary question.
Supplementary question, Right Honourable Winston Peters.
Does he stand by his statement, and I quote him, I actually think that New Zealand should show solidarity with other countries that have applied sanctions on Russia because of the actions it has undertaken. The reason that we do not have bilateral sanctions on Russia is to do with the fact that actually this Parliament will not give the government the authority to do that because it is blocked by the Labour Party, end of quotes.
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr Speaker, yes, I stand by this.
Supplementary question.
Supplementary question, the Right Honourable Winston
How
Peters.
can he possibly reconcile that statement with the Minister of Trade's statement this morning on resuming trade with Russia as being, and I quote him, a step in the right direction, end of quotes?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr Speaker, the member is confusing two different issues. The Minister of Trade continues to support the view, actually, that New Zealand should show solidarity, even though we don't have bilateral sanctions with Russia in relation to the Ukraine issue. What he was talking about was the removal of unilateral restrictions that were put on by Russia that well and truly predates this issue and goes back to 2011. Actually, the Minister of Trade is quite right for welcoming that.
Supplementary question.
Supplementary question, Jami-Lee Ross.
Does the Prime Minister stand by his statement that it's in the public interest for New Zealand to consider changing the New Zealand flag, and has he received any reports of former Prime Ministers supporting such a change?
Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr Speaker, yes, I do stand by those statements, and I've received advice that there are other Prime Ministers who have supported the view of changing the flag and in the history of our country. They include Helen Clark, David Longy, and last night I learned that it goes all the way back to big old Norman Kirk wanted to change the flag. There's 3 Labor Prime Ministers that were enlightened. Maybe that's what it takes to become a Labor Prime Minister, eh?
Order. Order. Supplementary question, the Right Honourable
Getting
Winston
back
Peters.
to reality, who has upset him most?
Order. I apologise to the member. Because of the level of interjection, I can't hear the member. Would the member start a supplementary question again?
Supplementary question. Who has upset him most? The opposition for somehow not allowing him to impose sanctions on Russia? His Minister of Trade, who is now advocating trading with Russia? Or himself for unofficially joining sanctions against Russia and advising Fonterra to do so as well?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Member's question is just fundamentally wrong.
Supplementary question, Right Honourable Winston Peters.
When will he start taking foreign affairs and trade seriously and stop making policy decisions on the golf courses of Hawaii in an attempt to suck up to the Americans who have thus far torpedoed his dairy industry TPPA negotiations?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr Speaker. Oh, OK. So the Labor Party's position now is that we should be supporting and trading with Russia, even though they've done the despicable things that we've seen take place in Crimea. That's a very interesting position for the Labor Party.
Order.
Speaker, point of order. I did not.
Point of order.
Speaker,
Order.
I did not ask him about the Labor Party or any other party's view on that supplementary question.
Order.
I asked him when he had stopped sucking up to the Americans.
When the member talks about a supplementary question, includes words like what's happened on a Hawaii golf course and sucking up the Americans, it gives very wide licence to the Prime Minister to answer the question. Order. Supplementary question, Andrew Little.
Mr Speaker, to the Prime Minister. Does he regret his pledge that he wouldn't let, quote, New Zealanders become tenants in their own country, end quotes? If not, why has he today refused to stand by that statement? Is it because he's ashamed of selling out New Zealand by rubber stamping every overseas buyer's application for the last 4 years?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Again, answer the first part of the question, no.
Supplementary.
Supplementary question, Andrew Little.
If he is really concerned about our country being sold out from under us, why has his government approved every application by overseas buyers to buy land since 2011?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr Speaker, the member will be aware that since 2008 the OIO introduced a pre-assessment rejection process, and I will add and note, Mr Speaker, the net amount of rural land approved for sale to foreign buyers has halved since National came into office.
Supplementary.
Supplementary question, Andrew Little.
Is he now reneging on his 2008 promise that Landcorp will not have its assets privatised, and before doing so will come back to the people of New Zealand with transparency and seek a mandate?
Order. Could the member please repeat the question?
Is he reneging on his 2008 promise that Landcorp will not have its assets privatised, and before doing so, quotes, will come back to the people of New Zealand with transparency and seek a mandate, end quotes?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Speaker, no, but Landcorp from time to time sells assets and it's free to do so.
Supplementary.
Order. Order. Supplementary question, Andrew Little.
Can he guarantee that any farms sold by Landcorp won't end up in foreign ownership, or is he going to flog them off to overseas buyers too?
The Right Honourable
Speaker,
Prime Minister.
No, because Landcorp buys and sells farms all the time. It's part of their core business. It's what they do.
Supplementary question, Andrew Little.
When will he finally admit that it's time to stop selling out New Zealand, and that we need proper rules that the government actually enforces to prevent the sale of any more of our land, unless there is significant proven benefit to New Zealand, and that we need a transparent register of all foreign owners of farms and forests?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr Speaker, I'll just stand by the government's record, which is the net amount of rural land approved for sale to foreigners is half under a national government than a Labor government. I just tell the member, why doesn't he go back to his normal form of policy development and pick out Chinese names from the phone book and give them a ring and pick on them?
Supplementary.
Supplementary question, Andrew Little.
Isn't the truth that he has taken no action to stop the sale of our productive land into overseas ownership, and his pledge to ensure we won't become tenants in our own land is just more hollow words from a hollow man?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr Speaker, well, he's angry because he's had to wait a wee while to ask this question. But, Mr Speaker, I stand by my record. We have sold half the amount of land that occurred under a Labor government. We've actually done a pretty good job in that regard.
Order. 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 Would the front bench to my right please stop interjecting? Supplementary question, Right Honourable Winston Peters.
Supplementary question. Is it not a fact that the real reason he as Prime Minister was opposed to New Zealand First to register foreign land and home ownership in New Zealand is that it would show that New Zealanders under his watch are fast becoming tenants in their own country?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
No.
Question number 7, Stephen Browning.